Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mireille Bejjani. I am a member of Mothers Out Front, which is an environmental group. I have today a guest speaker, and her name is Mireille Bejjani. She is originally from New York City, but now lives in Greenfield, Massachusetts. She has a great experience with environmental issues. She's part of the Slingshot organization, which is an environmental justice group that deals with all environmental groups across the nation. Today, she's presenting Fix the Grid campaign, which is very important to us as Mothers Out Front, but all of you as constituents and members of Winthrop. She is originally, as I said, comes from New York City. She's a graduate of Stanford University, and she has worked with many, many environmental groups across the country. So right now, I'd like to introduce Bejjani and Ms. Bejjani, and she will give you all the information that she has on Fix the Grid campaign and environmental issues that are so important to us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary Alice. As Mary Alice said, my name is Mireille Bejjani. I'm the co-executive director of Slingshot, which is a regional environmental justice organization. We work with the communities most impacted by environmental health threats to take aim at polluters and build community power. I'm also the facilitator of the Fix the Grid campaign, which is a regional grassroots effort to accelerate a just transition to a clean, renewable electric system. And I'll tell you all about that campaign through this presentation. Before I dig into more about Fix the Grid, just a little bit more information about Slingshot. As I mentioned, we are a regional organization. We cover all 6 states in New England, and we work with frontline communities on a number of different topics that mostly fall into 4 different categories: water, waste, energy, and toxics. So here in Massachusetts, I do a lot of work around fossil fuel infrastructure and other types of energy projects. I am helping communities stop new fossil fuel power plants, fracked gas pipelines, etc. We also do a lot of work in waste in terms of landfills, incinerators, waste processing facilities, and other polluting industries. So today I'm here for Fix the Grid campaign, which is, as I said, a regional effort. And through Fix the Grid, we try to connect the dots between the on-the-ground communities that are fighting fossil fuel infrastructure in their own backyard and the regional landscape that is enabling and continuing to support those fossil fuel projects. So I'm going to get into a little bit more of our grid. First of all, what is the grid? So the electric grid is a complex, just-in-time system for making and almost instantaneously delivering a standardized electrical current everywhere at once. That's a quote from Gretchen Backe, an author who's written a lot on this topic. And the grid is really important because obviously we use electricity for so many things, whether that's lighting, appliances, heating. Those appliances can include medical devices that people's lives depend on. And so having a reliable source of electricity is critical to our society today, especially as we work on electrifying our homes, our cars, our systems to move away from fossil fuels. We need to make sure that we are producing enough power to meet that demand. And that's where things like our energy markets and planning and transmission and distribution all come into play. So the grid is the system that makes sure that we are creating enough power to distribute at all times, that we are sending that power to where it's needed, that customers are able to receive that power and use it, and that we are planning forward so that in a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, we are going to have enough power to meet increased demand. And so another key part of our grid is that supply must equal demand always. electrons, when they're generated, they have to go somewhere. So they either get used or they get stored. Now that we have battery storage, we can be thinking about storing more power for later use. And on the slides, you can see an image of our country with different regions. So we have different regional grid operators. We'll talk a bit more about what those are. We are in the green area in the top corner. ISO New England is our grid operator. And the image of this large switchboard is our grid operator's headquarters in Holyoke, Massachusetts. And that's where they manage the grid. They make sure that power is being produced and sent to where it's needed, and potentially calling new power plants to turn on when demand goes up, etc. So who is the grid? This is where we get into the alphabet soup of our energy system. ISO New England is our independent system operator for New England. They are the ones who operate the grid. They take care of the energy markets where energy is bought and sold for various prices. They plan for the future, so they plan on 3-year cycles. So right now, in 2023, they are holding an auction to secure the electricity they think they're going to need to meet demand in 2026. And they're a nonprofit entity that spans the entire region and has a board of directors that are mostly former utility executives or other folks who have worked in the energy industry. And then NEPOOL is the New England Power Pool. So this is a stakeholder group of ISO New England. Part of the way that ISO New England is somewhat regulated by the federal government is through having a stakeholder process where other entities can vote on the rules that ISO New England puts forward. So when they want to change how they run their markets or what kinds of payments they give to different power plants for certain services, et cetera, the NEPOOL process needs to approve those rules before they get sent to the federal government for final approval. And the New England Power Pool includes utilities and different entities that consume energy, both end users such as individual ratepayers and also companies that use power, companies that use power, environmental organizations have a few seats at the table, so it's a kind of a broad swath of people who weigh in on these proposals. And then NESCO is the New England States Committee on Electricity. And this is a body that represents all 6 states in New England. Each governor appoints 1 or 2 members of their state administration to this committee to discuss together and come to consensus on what the state's perspective is on various regional energy processes. And they put out vision statements, they put out recommendations. They don't have direct leverage over ISO New England. They can't tell ISO do this or don't do that, but they can put forward, we as the representatives of the governors want to see you work in this direction or do this kind of thing. And they mostly focus on price, reliability, and environmental concerns to a certain degree. And then moving up to the larger scale, we've got FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And so that's it's a federal agency, and it's a commission that usually includes 5 commissioners. Right now there are only 4. We're waiting for Biden to appoint a 5th member to be confirmed. And they have authority over rates and practices that are put in place by regional operators. And that authority is really tied into these words, just and reasonable. That's how they have to make their decisions. They have to determine, these rates are not just and reasonable. So ISO New England, you have to do this differently to ensure that rates are just and reasonable. And lastly, we have the ratepayer advocates, and it varies a little bit from state to state. In some states, it's an entire office, or it's more of a person or 2. In Massachusetts, our Attorney General's office is our ratepayer advocate, and so they have a division of the Attorney General's office that weighs in on regional energy affairs and advocates to make sure that we are not paying rates that are too expensive and that, ensuring affordability for us as customers. So now that we've outlined who's involved in our grid, let's talk a bit about the problem that we're facing. ISO New England is a black box of decision making. They have their own space, within the board of directors and within their staff, where they make decisions on how they want to run the energy markets, how they want to plan for the future, what kinds of things they take into account in the studies that they conduct, etc. And their stakeholder process, NEPOOL, is of course within that world of decision making. But then the problem is that ratepayers and individual residents across the region are not in that space. They are excluded from the decision-making process due to a lack of transparency and accountability and accessibility. But the people who are in that room are utilities and fossil fuel interests. They influence a lot of the decisions that are happening because they have strong voting power in the stakeholder process, and a lot of the members of ISO New England's board of directors come from the revolving door of the energy industry. So what that means is that the decisions that come out of ISO New England in large part favor fossil fuels and keep us hooked on these dirty, polluting sources of energy. And just last year in 2022, 52% of our electricity in the region came from fracked gas, and only 12% came from renewable sources. So there's a lot of work that we need to do to move our grid towards the clean energy future that we need. And in order to get there, we need to break open the black box of decision making and make sure that ratepayers and state leadership have a seat at the table. Because that is how we will, through that governance reform, we will achieve accountability so that decisions, the leaders can be held accountable for the impacts of their decisions on those who are paying the price. We need transparency so we know what's happening while it's happening and not just hearing about it once it's a done deal. We need accessibility, both in terms of the language that's used, the ways things are explained. I had a community leader call me once and say, "Can you explain what ISO New England is? Because I looked at their website and it didn't help me at all." Their website is completely opaque to someone who isn't a seasoned energy industry insider. And we also need democracy in our electric system. We need decisions to be the result of the will of the people and in the public interest. And that is how we will get to a just, distributed, renewable, and resilient energy system. So how do we get there? Because it's a pretty picture, but how do we get from where we are to where we want to be? And this is where things get a little bit tricky because, as I mentioned, we don't have any direct levers of influence. ISO New England is not accountable to us. We as ratepayers can't really force them to do anything. But we have a lot more power through our elected officials, through our ratepayer advocates, and through the New England States Committee on Electricity. They all have more of a platform and more leverage than we do as individual ratepayers. So our goal is to have them use their platform to relay our demands to ISO New England, have them exercise the leverage that they hold as state leadership and in positions of power to give ISO New England that extra nudge and make sure that they're working in the right direction. And so that's why our targets on this campaign are state leaders, such as governors and the heads of agencies, for example, the Department of Public Utilities. And our theory of change for how we're going to build this grid that we need is by pushing the states to leverage their influence and relay our demands. And what are those demands? There are a lot of ways that we could reform our grid, and we are primarily focused on the governance pieces, really changing how decisions get made so that the types of decisions that come out of that process are the ones that we need for our clean energy future. And these reforms fall into three categories: changes to public participation, changes to ISO New England's work and leadership, and changes to the governance of the stakeholder process, NEPOOL. So when it comes to public participation, as I mentioned, it's a completely opaque and inaccessible process right now. For one thing, the fact that I had to spend an entire section of this talk explaining the acronyms that relate to our regional grid, that shows how hard it is for the average ratepayer to jump into this process and have a sense of what's going on and advocate for themselves. So we need to create or overhaul a space that really facilitates public participation at a regional level, that helps people who decide that they want to know more about our electric grid, that they want to weigh in on the decisions that are happening, that helps those people submit comments where they can submit comments. It helps them talk to the right people if they have questions, helps them understand all the technical documents that are coming out on a regular basis about our markets and our grid, etc., and break down the jargon so that there isn't this wall between the people who consider themselves to be the only experts whose voices are worth listening to and the ratepayers whose rates are funding this entire system. And then when it comes to ISO New England and their work, we want to make sure that they have a clearly explicit statement about a just transition to renewable energy in their mission statement. Currently, their mission has nothing to do with the clean energy transition. It's all about price and reliability, which granted are very important parts of our grid, but cannot be, we cannot forget that the energy transition is as essential. We also want them to create a department that holds environmental justice expertise. When they put out reports, which they've done a lot of recently, talking about what the next few years could look like and the next few decades, they never talk about the impacts of the grid on frontline communities, on environmental justice populations that are the most impacted by our fossil fuel infrastructure. And often the reason that's given is that they don't have that knowledge. They don't know how to quantify it, how to include it in their research. And so we want them to hire people who have that expertise, who can make sure that we're taking into account the social costs of our grid. And lastly, we want them to have clear benchmarks for decarbonization. They need to have a timeline for their transition off fossil fuels. And then at the leadership level of ISO New England, we desperately need representation from the states on the board of directors. As I mentioned before, that board is not very transparent. They had their first ever public board meeting in November of 2022 as a result of all of the campaign work that we've been doing for years. And lots of people showed up at that meeting and spoke out because it was their opportunity to be face-to-face with the board of directors and make their voices heard. But on that board, state leadership, our governors who are elected by us as ratepayers, have no direct recourse at ISO New England. So we need to have members of the board of directors that directly represent state interests. And lastly, in terms of leadership at ISO New England, we want to replace Gordon Van Welly, the CEO, with a new CEO who is ready to really work on climate. And then from the NEPOOL perspective, that's the stakeholder process, the New England Power Pool, they have so many measures of confidentiality that make it tremendously difficult to share information out of that space and have a sense of what's happening. We need to open that up for transparency and accountability. And the voting system gives too much weight to utilities and fossil fuels and too little weight to state leadership and ratepayer representation, and we need to flip that equation. So next, we want to think about, why is this something to work on here in our region and in Massachusetts specifically, and why is now a good time to be working on reforming our grid? So in terms of this region, we have some of the strongest climate legislation in the country in New England, and Massachusetts is one of the leaders on that front. But at the same time, we have one of the most opaque grid operators in the country. Not only is ISO New England bad in a lot of ways in how they go about these situations, they're worse than a lot of their counterparts. And that's not a good mix. We are not going to reach our climate goals if we don't have a grid operator that is facilitating that process. And why now? We have a new administration in Massachusetts. Governor Healy has come in and has shown so far that she is committed to working on the climate crisis. Her new Secretary of Energy and Environmental Affairs, Rebecca Tepper, recently created a new division, the Office for Federal and Regional Affairs, which is really exciting. It shows that she understands how important this topic is, and she's committing staff, time, and energy to working on those questions. We have a lot of momentum and visibility. Barely a week goes by when there isn't some kind of article or op-ed or letter to the editor in a statewide publication about our grid, about the problems we need to be overcoming as we go about the clean energy transition. And Most recently, over the course of the winter, electric rates went up tremendously. So in some cases, upwards of 40%. And that really hammers home the problems with our status quo. We rely too much on fossil fuels. We're too susceptible to the volatility of gas prices around the world. And that is leading not only to people's savings being impacted, people having to choose between putting food on the table and paying their electric bills, but it also is an added impact on top of the pollution we're already dumping into overburdened communities. So to recap our strategy on this campaign, we are focusing on New England governors and the state agency heads and ratepayer advocates. We want them to move towards accountability, transparency, democracy, and decarbonization in our grid by leveraging their influence as leaders in the region. We want them to be our heroes because they'll be hearing from constituents, from frontline organizations, environmental groups, so many different stakeholders through lots of different tactics. We just had a rally earlier today that I'll touch on a little bit more. We're working on having meetings with elected officials, holding events, getting media coverage. And there's always lots happening related to the grid, so we're keeping tabs on different opportunities for us to weigh in and make sure that our leaders are hearing from us. And so that's the regional strategy, and we know that the more locally tailored our plan is, the more effective it will be. And that's why we are honing in and creating a state-specific plan, a version of that plan in each New England state. What works in Massachusetts doesn't necessarily make sense in Maine or in New Hampshire, depending on the elected officials, on the landscape there, the priorities of ratepayers. So we are having lots of conversations and digging in at a local level to make sure that our campaign makes sense, given the political and environmental landscape of each state that we're working in. And I want to kind of wrap up by talking a bit about the Fix the Grid campaign and emphasizing how it is a campaign as opposed to a coalition. We are not looking for all the groups that are members of this campaign to agree on all of the things that we are working on. Rather, we know that we need real reform, in the governance of our grid, and there are a lot of things that we all want to see happen. So a lot of groups have jumped in with Fix the Grid with certain tactics that they are excited about, or certain approaches or messaging points, and we're lucky to be able to work with so many groups across the region who are putting energy and time into this work. That's what makes us more and more powerful as the movement grows. And there are lots of ways to plug in with this work. So let us know if you're interested. You can reach out to me. It's Mireille at slingshot.org. You can check out the Fix the Grid website, which is fix-the-grid.org. And there's a contact form there if you have questions. We have information about upcoming activities on a regular basis, and we're working on updating our website with a lot more resources for folks to learn more about our grid. Since ISO New England isn't doing the work to educate the public, Fix the Grid is doing a lot of that work ourselves to demystify these systems for people who want to plug in. And today was our most recent action. We had a rally this morning, the Boston Fee Party, our rally for clean energy, which some members of Mothers Out Front joined us for. This was a rally to really highlight how electric bills have skyrocketed as a result of our dependence on fossil fuels. And so we gathered on the Harbor Walk next to the Boston Children's Museum to listen to speakers talking about the impacts of our grid and of these high rates on lower income communities, on communities of color, the environmental injustice of a lot of the ways our grid currently works, and the state leadership that we need to see going forward. And we're excited to continue to partner with the Healy administration on that. So we'll probably have more actions coming up and more webinars. Stay tuned for that if you want to learn more. And in the meantime, don't hesitate to reach out with any questions. So I will leave it there and look forward to our conversation.
We would like to thank Mara for being here with us today. We are very fortunate, first of all, to have a fine young woman to represent our people as far as our climate change and for environmental justice. She's a hard worker. One thing I didn't mention is that she has worked all across our whole United States. So she's very familiar with all the regions and all of the issues that they have. And more than anything, just sitting here listening to her, watching the different screens, I've learned so much in the last half an hour than I think if I read 1,000,000 books. So I want to thank you for being here with us and how much we appreciate everything you did and told us today.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you.
Very good.